The night Kim Seo-yeon walked into the Hansung Elite Foundation Gala, she wasn't just a little girl in a pink dress anymore. She was the reason the most dangerous man in Seoul had gone very, very quiet. Inside that ballroom, 50 of Korea's most powerful families were about to discover something that would change the way they spoke to their children at breakfast. What none of them knew yet was that the answer to a question nobody had dared ask, who touched his daughter, was standing right in front of them. This is that story. Stay until the end. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Seo-yeon's story travels. The Grand Silla Hotel rose above Seoul like a blade catching light. Its main ballroom, the kind of room that exists specifically to remind people of the distance between themselves and everyone else, glittered beneath tiered crystal chandeliers. Outside, November wind pressed against floor-to-ceiling windows. Inside, Korea's elite circulated with the practiced ease of people who had long ago stopped questioning whether they belonged anywhere. Kim Min-jun stood near the entrance, one hand resting in his jacket pocket, the other holding a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. His driver, Sung-ho, stood 3 steps behind him, close enough to be useful, far enough to be invisible. She's been near the dessert table for 11 minutes, Sung-ho said quietly. Alone. Min-jun didn't respond. His eyes had already found her. Seo-yeon stood beside a tower of macarons in her pink dress, the one with the small silver threads she'd chosen herself, because it sparkled, APPA, look how it sparkles. She was holding a small plate she hadn't eaten from. She was watching a group of girls her age laugh at something on the other side of the room. She was not part of the joke. She was not part of anything. She was doing the thing Min-jun had been watching her do for 3 weeks now, the careful, practiced performance of a child pretending not to mind. He recognized it because he had done it himself, once, a long time ago in a different kind of room. Before he learned to stop pretending and start becoming something that rooms were afraid of instead. His jaw tightened. Mr. Kim. A hand on his arm, light, presumptuous, the kind of touch that assumed familiarity. Lee Dong-hyun, property developer, golf partner of the education minister, the sort of man who collected important acquaintances the way other people collected receipts. Didn't expect to see you at one of these. Your little girl looks just like you, by the way. Min-jun looked at the hand on his arm first. Then at Lee Dong-hyun. The hand was removed. She does, Min-jun said. Remember that. Lee Dong-hyun laughed uncertainly, and found somewhere else to be. Min-jun turned back to Seo-yeon. She still hadn't touched the macarons. One of the girls from the group across the room said something to another, and both of them looked at Seo-yeon, and then looked away with the specific, deliberate cruelty that children learn from watching adults decide who matters. Seo-yeon's expression didn't change. That was the part that made something cold move through Min-jun's chest, not the cruelty, but the fact that his daughter had already learned not to react to it. 6 years old. Already trained to absorb. He set his untouched glass on a passing waiter's tray and began walking toward her. Across the room, a woman in structured ivory, Park Ji-soo, head of the Hanguk International Academy Parent Committee, the kind of person who wielded a school newsletter like a weapon, watched him move through the crowd and leaned toward the woman beside her. That's him, Park Ji-soo said. Kim Min-jun. The woman beside her followed her gaze. He actually came. Apparently. Park Ji-soo's smile was the kind that didn't involve her eyes. I heard he pulled Seo-yeon out of class last week to take her to lunch. Can you imagine? A man like that, trying to do school pickup. They laughed softly, the way people laugh when they believe they are safe. They were not safe. Min-jun reached his daughter. He crouched down to her level, a movement that looked wrong on a man his size, a man who operated entirely in vertical authority, and looked at her face. Seo-yeon ah. She looked up. For a half second, something crossed her expression. Relief, quickly folded back into careful neutrality. APPA. I'm fine. He looked at the untouched plate. At the group of girls still laughing across the room. At the specific way his daughter was standing, shoulders slightly curved inward, making herself smaller than she was, taking up less space than she deserved. I know you're fine, he said quietly. You're always fine. She nodded, and the nodding was the saddest thing in the room. Min-jun stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked across the ballroom at Park Ji-soo, who was still watching, still smiling that particular smile. The smile faded. She had just made the mistake that everyone who had ever underestimated Kim Min-jun had made. She had looked at his daughter and seen a liability. She had looked at him and seen a rumor. She had not yet understood that the rumor was about to walk across the room and introduce himself. And by the time this evening was over, every parent in this ballroom would have the same question. Who touched his daughter? Nobody would want to be the answer. The invitation had arrived 3 days late. Every other girl in Seo-yeon's class had received theirs on a Monday, tucked inside pale yellow envelopes with gold foil butterflies on the seal. Seo-yeon had found hers on a Thursday, slipped under the classroom door during lunch, no envelope, no butterfly, just a folded card with her name written in someone else's handwriting because Chae-won had made her mother do it. She had brought it home and held it like it was something precious. She had asked her housekeeper, Mrs. O, to press her pink dress. She had not told anyone about the 3 days. The party was held at the Lotte World Tower private event floor, the kind of venue that required a guest list and a dedicated elevator and staff who wore matching uniforms and never made eye contact unless spoken to first. Balloon arrangements in Chae-won's favorite colors, lavender and cream, floated at every corner. A dessert tower. A cake imported from a bakery in Paris that Seo-yeon had heard the mothers discussing in voices that meant the price was the point. Seo-yeon arrived with Mrs. O, who squeezed her hand at the elevator and said, "You look beautiful." Seo-yeon smiled and stepped inside and watched the floors rise and practiced not wanting anything too much. The room was already full when she arrived. She could tell immediately, the way children can, that the social architecture had already been established. Chae-won stood at the center with her 4 closest friends arranged around her like planets in a private orbit. They wore matching lavender ribbons in their hair. Seo-yeon's dress was pink. "You came," Chae-won said when she saw her, in the specific tone that turned a greeting into a verdict. "Thank you for inviting me," Seo-yeon said, because Mrs. O had coached her on this, because manners were armor if you wore them correctly. Chae-won looked at her dress for 1 extra second. Then she turned back to her orbit and the conversation resumed, and Seo-yeon was neither included nor directly excluded, which was somehow more precise than either. She existed at the edge of things. She found a chair near the dessert table, and sat in it and placed her small bag on her lap, and watched the room the way she had learned to watch rooms, carefully, quietly, looking for the rules so she could follow them, looking for the door in case she needed it. The games began. Musical chairs, then a relay race through a course of lavender balloons. Seo-yeon played both without drawing attention in either direction. She was not bad at things. She had simply learned that being visibly good at things annoyed Chae-won, and annoying Chae-won had consequences that lasted longer than any game. During the relay race, she tripped. It was a small stumble, nothing serious, but she landed on her knee and her dress flared up around her, and for a half second she was just a little girl on the floor at a party, and the room noticed. Chae-won's friend Yuna laughed first. Not a big laugh. A small, private one, directed at Chae-won, who received it with a slight smile and said nothing, which was worse than if she had laughed herself. Seo-yeon stood up, smoothed her dress, and said she was fine before anyone asked. Nobody had been about to ask. She spent the next 40 minutes near the dessert tower, with a plate she refilled twice without eating from, because holding a plate gave her hands something to do. She watched the mothers cluster near the windows in their own orbit, designer handbags on the chairs beside them like reserved seats. She heard fragments. "His business," one of them said. "You know what they say." And then a lowered voice and then laughter of the specific kind that meant the thing being laughed at wasn't funny. She didn't hear her father's name. She didn't need to. She recognized the shape of the conversation. Across the city, in an office building that occupied 4 floors of Gangnam's most expensive address, Kim Min-jun was ending a meeting that had begun at 7 in the morning. His desk held 3 phones, a glass of water he hadn't touched, and a dossier on a competitor whose financial infrastructure was about to develop significant complications. His assistant had reminded him twice that Seo-yeon's party had started at 4. He had said he was aware. He had not left. At 6:15, the party ended. Seo-yeon rode the elevator down with Mrs. O, her pink dress still perfect, her plate left behind untouched. Mrs. O asked if she had fun. "Yes," Seo-yeon said. She looked out the car window the whole ride home and didn't say anything else, and Mrs. O, who had been watching this child for 3 years, noted the particular quality of the silence and said a prayer for the people responsible for it. Sung-ho had worked for Kim Min-jun for 12 years. In that time, he had driven him to meetings that ended careers, waited outside buildings where decisions were made that never appeared in any newspaper, and sat behind the wheel of 3 different vehicles that had been replaced without explanation. He had learned, across those 12 years, exactly one rule that governed his continued employment and his continued health: he did not offer opinions. He did not ask questions. He delivered people and packages in silence, and he did it without color or commentary. He had never left anything on the back seat. Until Tuesday morning, when Min-jun opened the rear door of the black Genesis and found a folded piece of paper on the leather beside him. No envelope. His name wasn't on it. It sat there the way something sits when the person who left it needed to communicate something they couldn't say out loud. Min-jun looked at it for a moment before picking it up. Sung-ho kept his eyes on the road. His posture was exactly what it always was: straight, neutral, professionally absent. But his hands on the wheel were fractionally tighter than usual, and Min-jun noticed this the way he noticed everything, which was immediately, and without acknowledgement. He unfolded the paper. 12 words in Sung-ho's careful handwriting. "Seo-yeon cried again today. She asked me not to tell you." Min-jun read it once. He folded it back along its original crease. He placed it in his jacket pocket. He said nothing. The city moved past the windows. Gangnam in the early morning, delivery trucks, school buses, the particular quality of light that Seoul wore in November, pale and specific and indifferent. They passed Seo-yeon's school without slowing. Min-jun looked at the gate as they went by. He looked at the children filing through it in their uniforms, their oversized backpacks, their various expressions of mourning unwillingness. He did not see his daughter among them. She had already gone in. Again, the note had said. "Not today." Again. His assistant, Park Jin-woo, was waiting at the office entrance with a tablet and a schedule and the specific expression he wore when the day was already complicated. He began talking at the elevator. A conflict with the Busan contingent, a compliance issue on the 3rd floor, a call from the lawyer handling the Incheon warehouse matter. Min-jun walked past him into the elevator. Jin-woo followed, still talking. The elevator closed. Min-jun looked at the floor numbers ascending and said, quietly, "Clear my afternoon." Jin-woo stopped mid-sentence. He looked at the tablet. He looked at Min-jun's profile, the set jaw, the particular stillness that was different from his usual stillness in ways that 12 years of proximity had taught Jin-woo to read accurately. He did not ask why. He did not suggest rescheduling strategies or propose alternatives. He typed something on the tablet and said, "Done." This was the second rule that governed continued employment. When Min-jun's stillness changed quality, you did not ask questions. You cleared the afternoon and you waited. They reached the top floor. Min-jun walked to his office. He stood at the window for a moment, looking at the city below, the grid of it, the density, the particular satisfaction of a place he understood completely. He knew where money moved in this city and who moved it. He knew which buildings held which secrets, and which secrets held which men. He had spent 20 years building a form of knowledge that was indistinguishable from power, and wielding it with the patience of someone who had never needed to hurry, because nothing had ever been capable of running from him. He took out his phone and called a number that appeared in no directory. It rang once. "There's a school," Min-jun said. "Hanguk International Academy. I need everything. Administrative records, incident reports, staff communications. Parent committee membership and meeting minutes for the last 6 months." He paused. "Surveillance footage from the common areas if it exists. Cafeteria. Playground. Hallways." A brief silence. Then, "Understood." He ended the call and put the phone in his pocket beside the folded note. He remained at the window a moment longer. Below, Seoul operated with its usual precision, thousands of people moving through thousands of decisions, most of them believing their private lives were exactly that. They were only private until they weren't. He thought about Seo-yeon, at 6 years old, asking someone not to tell him. He thought about the shape of that request, the consideration in it, the protection. She had been protecting him from something she had decided was her problem to carry. 6 years old and already managing his feelings around her own pain. He thought about where she had learned that. The answer arrived before the question finished forming, and it sat in his chest like something he deserved. He turned from the window, straightened his jacket, and picked up the first file from his desk. There were 4 hours of work between now and his cleared afternoon. He would do them without distraction, without error, and without wasting a single minute on anything that was not essential. His daughter had been carrying something alone. He intended to find out exactly how heavy it was. The files arrived at 9:17 that evening. Jin-woo placed a sealed folder on Min-jun's desk without comment, and left without being dismissed, which meant he had looked at the contents and made a decision about the appropriate response to them. This told Min-jun something before he opened anything. He read for 2 hours without stopping. The school's administrative records were thorough in the way that institutional records were thorough when someone was being careful, every incident logged, every note dated, the paper trail of a system that had documented its own failures with impressive consistency and acted on none of them. 3 incident reports in Seo-yeon's name over 6 weeks. The first noted that a student had knocked Seo-yeon's lunch tray in the cafeteria, and that it appeared accidental. The second noted a complaint from Seo-yeon's teacher, that Seo-yeon had been excluded from a group activity by several classmates. The third noted that Seo-yeon had been found sitting alone in the bathroom, during recess, for the second time in a week. All 3 had been filed by the same teacher. All 3 had been reviewed and signed by the same administrator. All 3 had received the same written response, word for word, across all 3 forms, matter noted. Will monitor. Will monitor. Min-jun set the folder down and looked at the wall for a moment. Then he picked it up again and continued reading. The surveillance footage came on a separate drive. Jin-woo had labeled specific timestamps in a document clipped to the front, which meant Jin-woo had watched it first, which again told Min-jun something about what he was about to see. He watched for 90 minutes. He watched without expression. He watched the cafeteria footage from 3 different dates and he identified the girl Jin, who had noted in the margin, Kim Chae-won, 6 years old, daughter of Park Ji-soo, parent committee chair, with the efficiency of someone assembling an accurate picture from available data. Chae-won was not dramatic. This was what Min-jun registered first. She did not push or shout or do anything that would have been visible from a distance. She operated in a register that required closeness to read, a turned shoulder, a whispered word that redirected the group, a look that lasted precisely long enough to communicate exclusion, and then disappeared into an expression of perfect innocence. She had learned it somewhere. Nobody was born knowing how to do it with that much precision. On the 3rd tape, Min-jun watched Seo-yeon arrive at the lunch table with her tray, find the space beside her usual seat occupied by a bag that hadn't been there when she stood up, and make the calculation in under 2 seconds. The quiet, practiced calculation of a child who had learned to assess before reacting. She carried her tray to the end of the table. She ate alone, facing slightly away from the group. She did not look back. Min-jun pressed pause. He sat with that image for longer than he sat with any other. His daughter's back. The careful angle of her shoulders. The specific posture of someone who had decided that wanting to belong was more dangerous than pretending not to. He pressed play and continued watching. The following morning he arrived at Hanguk International Academy at 8:40, which was 10 minutes after drop-off ended and 20 minutes before the administrative office opened to parents. He waited in the reception area with the patience of a man who understood that waiting was its own form of pressure. When the administrator, a woman named Cho Hyun-ji, arrived and found him already seated, the sequence of her reactions was informative. Recognition first, then surprise, then the specific rearrangement of expression that people performed when they needed a moment to decide who they were going to be. She chose professional warmth. This was a mistake. Min-jun was not warm in return. He was courteous, which was different. He sat across from her desk and asked her to walk him through the 3 incident reports filed on his daughter's behalf. He asked her to explain, specifically, what monitoring had been undertaken following each filing, and what outcomes that monitoring had produced. He asked these questions in the tone he used for financial discrepancies, not accusatory, just precise, the tone of someone who already had the answers, and was giving the other person the courtesy of providing them independently. Cho Hyun-ji said that the school took all social conflict seriously. She said that children this age often worked through social dynamics naturally. She said that the teacher had been briefed and was keeping a close eye on the situation. Min-jun listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he said, the second incident report was filed 8 days after the first. The third was filed 6 days after the second. In your experience, how many reports constitute a pattern? She didn't answer. He hadn't expected her to. He stood, thanked her for her time, and left. In the parking lot, Sung-ho held the door open and closed it after him, and returned to the driver's seat without speaking. They drove in silence for 4 minutes before Min-jun said, I need Park Ji-soo's address. Sung-ho didn't write it down. He already knew it. Min-jun looked out the window and felt, beneath the cold precision of everything he was building, something that had no name yet, but was gathering weight by the hour. The monthly parent committee meeting was held in the school's conference room on the 2nd floor, the one with the long oval table, and the motivational posters on the walls and the window that overlooked the courtyard where the younger children had recess. It began at 7 in the evening. It was not open to the general parent body. Attendance required committee membership, which required nomination, which required the approval of the committee chair. Park Ji-soo had not approved Kim Min-jun's attendance. He came anyway. He arrived at 6:58 and took a seat at the back of the room before anyone else had settled, which meant that when the committee members filed in, he was already there, jacket on, hands folded on the table, watching the door with the patient attention of someone who had scheduled this a long time ago. The reactions moved through the room in a wave. A pause at the entrance. A redirected glance. The particular recalibration of posture that occurred when a space changed its character without anyone agreeing to let it. Park Ji-soo arrived at 7:02. She saw him from the doorway. Something crossed her face, not fear exactly, but the precursor to it, the moment before the body decides whether what it is looking at constitutes a threat. She composed herself in under 2 seconds, which was faster than most people could have managed, and took her seat at the head of the table. "I don't believe we've had the pleasure," she said, in the tone she used for things that were not pleasures. "Kim Min-jun," he said. Seo-yeon's father. A brief silence. Then Park Ji-soo smiled at the room and said, "Of course." "Welcome," in a voice that meant the opposite, and opened her agenda folder, and began. Min-jun said nothing for 40 minutes. He sat while Park Ji-soo moved through the agenda with the efficiency of someone who had been running this room for 3 years and intended to run it for 20 more. Fundraising for the Spring Cultural Festival. A proposal to update the cafeteria menu. A discussion of the school's academic enrichment schedule, in which Park Ji-soo referenced her own daughter's piano performance twice without appearing to notice she had done it. She was good at this, at performing leadership so fluently it looked natural, at making the room's attention feel like something she was generously distributing rather than carefully controlling. He watched her work and noted everything. The committee members spoke when prompted and agreed more often than they disagreed, and the one parent who raised a mild objection about the fundraising cost structure was handled with such graceful redirection that she was thanking Park Ji-soo before she realized she'd conceded the point. The principal, a man named Lee Sang-won, who sat to Park Ji-soo's left and had the expression of someone permanently in the process of hoping things would resolve themselves, offered institutional endorsements at the appropriate intervals. At 7:41, Park Ji-soo reached the final agenda item. Community standards. The importance of ensuring Hanguk International Academy maintained its reputation as an environment that reflected the values of its families. She spoke about stability. About the particular responsibility that came with enrolling a child in a school of this caliber. About how children absorbed the values modeled by the adults in their lives, and how the committee took seriously its role in shaping the community culture. "We think a great deal," she said, "about the kind of home environments our children are coming from. The stability. The example being set." She paused in the way people paused when they wanted the room to fill in what they hadn't said. The room understood. Several people did not look at Min-jun, which was itself a form of looking. "I have a question," Min-jun said. The room went quiet so completely that the ventilation system became audible. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He spoke from his seat at the back of the room in the same register he had used all evening, measured, clear, the tone of a man who had never needed volume to be heard. "In the past 6 weeks, 3 incident reports have been filed documenting my daughter being excluded, humiliated, and isolated by the same group of students, in this building, under the supervision of this administration." He looked at Lee Sang-won, who appeared to have stopped breathing. All 3 were reviewed, signed, and responded to with the same 2 words. "We'll monitor." He let that sit for a moment. "I am curious what monitoring produced. I'd like to hear that answer from whoever in this room is responsible for it." Nobody spoke. "I'm also curious," Min-jun continued, "about the values you were just describing. The stability. The example being set." He looked at Park Ji-soo with the specific attention of someone who had finished assembling a picture and found it exactly as unpleasant as expected. "My daughter is 6 years old. She has been eating lunch alone for 5 weeks. She has stopped telling me about her day. She asked the person who finally told me about this not to say anything." He paused. "I'd like someone to explain to me which family's home environment produced that outcome." The silence was the loudest thing the room had ever contained. Lee Sang-won opened his folder, closed it, and said that the school would be undertaking a comprehensive review of its student welfare protocols, effective immediately, and that he would personally ensure a full report was delivered to all parents within the week. Min-jun thanked him, stood, and left without looking at Park Ji-soo again. He didn't need to. The fallout was swift, quiet, and total. By Thursday morning, 2 days after the committee meeting, Chae-won was absent from school. By Friday, 2 more children from the same group had stopped appearing at drop-off, their parents having submitted withdrawal requests through the administrative office with explanations that cited scheduling changes, relocation, a previously unconsidered private tutoring arrangement. Lee Sang-won signed the paperwork and did not call anyone to discuss it, which was its own form of answer. Park Ji-soo resigned from the parent committee chair by email on Wednesday evening. The email cited personal commitments and expressed warm gratitude for the opportunity to serve the school community. It was 4 sentences long and had clearly been written by someone choosing each word with the specific care of a person who understood that written records persisted. She did not mention the meeting. She did not mention Min-jun. She did not contact him directly, which was the smartest decision she had made in the entire duration of this situation. The school's new student welfare policy arrived in every parent's inbox by the following Monday. 12 pages. A formal anti-bullying framework with reporting structures, intervention timelines, an apparent liaison role that had apparently existed in concept for 2 years and had now, with remarkable institutional urgency, been implemented in full. Lee Sang-won sent a separate personal email to Min-jun acknowledging the school's prior shortcomings and outlining the steps being taken. He used the word accountability 4 times. Min-jun read the email once and did not respond. On paper, everything was resolved. He told himself this on Tuesday morning while reviewing contracts, and again on Tuesday afternoon during a call with his legal team, and again on Tuesday evening when Sung-ho pulled up to the school for afternoon pickup and Seo-yeon climbed into the back seat in her uniform with her oversized backpack and her careful expression. And Min-jun looked at her face and understood immediately that the paper version of Resolved and the actual version were not the same document. She was quiet on the ride home. Not her usual quiet, which was the quiet of a child processing the day, cataloguing small events, preparing the edited version she would offer at dinner. This was a different quality of silence. Considered. Like she had been holding a question for several hours, and was deciding whether to ask it. They were in the elevator of their building, halfway to the upper floor, when she asked it. APPA. She was looking at the elevator doors, not at him. Did you scare them? Min-jun looked at her reflection in the polished metal. What do you mean? Chae-won isn't at school anymore. Yuna isn't either. She shifted the strap of her backpack. The teachers are being really nice to me now. Different nice. Like they are being careful. She paused. Did you scare them away? He considered his answer for the length of 2 floors. I spoke to the school, he said. I made sure they understood the situation. Seo-yeon was quiet for a moment. The elevator opened. She walked with him to the apartment door, and waited while he unlocked it, and followed him inside, and set her backpack down in its designated spot with the precision she always used, the small orderliness she had developed so young it seemed architectural rather than learned. Then she said, without turning around, because if you scared them, that means they were never really my friends. Min-jun stood in the entrance of his own apartment, and felt the sentence land in a way that nothing had landed in a very long time. It means they only stopped because they were scared, she continued. Her voice was even, the voice of a child working something out with the serious methodology of someone twice her age. Not because it was wrong. Not because they wanted to. She turned around and looked at him with her large, careful eyes. That's worse, APPA. That means nothing actually changed. He had no answer. He stood there, Min-jun, who had built an empire on the premise that problems responded to sufficient pressure, who had walked into a school committee meeting and entered the room through the precise application of his own weight. And he had absolutely nothing to say to his 6-year-old daughter. She seemed to understand that he was struggling, because she picked up her backpack again and said, "I'm going to do my homework," in the gentle tone of someone releasing a person from a conversation they couldn't finish. She walked to her room. The door closed softly. Min-jun remained where he was. The apartment was enormous and expensively silent around him. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed Seoul in the late afternoon, the city doing what it always did, moving, building, operating with its indifferent momentum. He had always found something steadying in that view. The scale of it. The confirmation that the world was large and organized and subject to patterns a careful man could read. It offered him nothing right now. He had removed the threat. He had cleared the board. He had done what he knew how to do with the tools he knew how to use, and his daughter had come home and told him, with the quiet precision of someone who had been thinking about it all day, that he had fixed the wrong thing. He had spent 20 years being the most capable person in any room he entered. He had never felt less capable than he did standing in his own hallway, listening to the silence behind a small closed door. He heard her at 11:14. He knew the time because he had not been sleeping. He had been in his study with a file open in front of him that he had not read a single word of since sitting down, and when the sound came through the wall, small, muffled, the sound of someone crying into a pillow with the specific technique of a child who had practiced not being heard, he closed the file and sat very still and listened to it for a moment that lasted much longer than a moment. Then he stood and walked to her door. He stood outside it in the hallway in the dark. The sound continued, soft and steady, the kind of crying that had moved past its acute stage into something more sustained and therefore more serious, the crying of someone who was not crying about a specific thing anymore, but about the accumulated weight of many things that had nowhere else to go. He recognized it without having heard it before. He recognized it the way you recognized something you had done yourself a long time ago, in a different life, in rooms that no longer existed. He opened the door. The night light in the corner threw a pale circle across the floor. Seo-yeon was in her bed with her back to the door, and her knees drawn up, and her face pressed into the pillow, and she did not hear him come in, or if she did she made no sign of it. Her pink dress from the week before was draped over the chair by the window where Mrs. O had hung it after pressing it, ready for the next occasion. Her small shoes were on the floor, one placed neatly by the chair, and one lying on its side near the foot of the bed, where she had apparently kicked it off and left it, which told him something about the state she had been in when she came to bed. He crossed the room and picked up the shoe. It fit in one hand. Patent leather, a small buckle on the strap, scuffed slightly on the toe from regular use. He held it the way he had once held a weapon, with the careful awareness of something that mattered, and sat down on the floor at the foot of her bed. Seo-yeon's breathing shifted slightly, the rhythm of it changing in the way that indicated awareness, but she didn't turn over and he didn't say anything. He simply sat on the floor of his daughter's bedroom in the dark with her shoe in his hands and listened to her breathing even out by degrees, slowing from the ragged cadence of tears toward something more regular. He thought about what she had said in the hallway. That's worse, APPA. That means nothing actually changed. He had been turning it over since she said it, the way he turned over problems that resisted his usual approach, looking for the angle that would open them. But this one had no angle. It was simply true, and it was true in a way that his intervention had made worse rather than better, and there was no restructuring that fact into something more manageable. He looked at the shoe in his hand. He had bought her 3 pairs at the beginning of the school year because Mrs. O had sent him a list and he had forwarded it to Jin-woo, and Jin-woo had purchased everything on it and arranged delivery, and Min-jun had not seen the shoes until Seo-yeon wore them to the Hansung Gala, and he had noticed them in the elevator and thought they suited her. He had not chosen them. He had not been in the shop when she tried them on. He did not know if she had an opinion about them, or if she had simply worn what appeared in her wardrobe without expecting to have been consulted. He did not know how many things she had simply worn without expecting to have been consulted. The crying had stopped. Her breathing had settled into the long, slow rhythm of sleep, but he stayed on the floor because there was nowhere else he was needed tonight, and because moving felt wrong, felt like the kind of leaving that had already happened too many times in ways neither of them had acknowledged. He had protected her from consequences. He had not protected her from loneliness. These were not the same thing, and he had spent 6 years treating them as though they were, arranging her life so that material comfort surrounded her so completely that the other absences might go unnoticed. She had noticed. She had simply been too careful to say so, which was the part he couldn't stop returning to, the carefulness of it, the consideration in her silence, the way she had learned to manage his limitations for him without anyone teaching her to do it. He stayed on the floor. At some point the night light seemed less necessary, and the window began to hold the first grey suggestion of morning, that tentative lightening that preceded dawn by half an hour in November, and Min-jun was still sitting with the shoe in his hands when Seo-yeon stirred. She turned over slowly with the unfocused blinking of a child returning from deep sleep, and she looked at the foot of her bed, and she found him there. She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. He looked back at her and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said, and he was only beginning to understand the difference between the two. Seo-yeon reached down and took her shoe from his hands. She held it in her lap and looked at it and then looked at him again, and something in her face changed in a way that was very small and very significant. "You stayed," she said. "Yes," he said. She nodded once, with the gravity of a child recording something important, and lay back down and pulled her blanket up, and Min-jun remained on the floor until she fell back to sleep. It started small, the way most structural changes did. He asked Mrs. O for Seo-yeon's teacher's name on a Wednesday morning while Seo-yeon was still at breakfast. Mrs. O looked at him with the carefully neutral expression she reserved for things that surprised her and said, "Kim Ji-young. She's been Seo-yeon's homeroom teacher since September." He wrote it down in the notes application on his phone between a reminder about a board meeting and a contact number for a Port Authority official in Busan. Kim Ji-young. He looked at it for a moment and then put his phone away and went to work. The following Monday he called the school and asked to be connected to Kim Ji-young's classroom voicemail. He left a message introducing himself as Seo-yeon's father, and asking whether there was a convenient time to discuss her progress. He used the word progress deliberately, because he wanted to talk about more than academics, and didn't yet have the vocabulary for what he actually meant. Kim Ji-young called back within the hour, which suggested she had been briefed on who he was, and they arranged a meeting for Thursday afternoon. He arrived on time and sat in a small chair across from a small desk in a classroom decorated with the artwork of 20 children, and he was, for possibly the first time in 2 decades, the least comfortable person in a room. Kim Ji-young was 31 and professional, and clearly had decided to treat him as simply another parent, which he appreciated more than he would have known how to express. She told him that Seo-yeon was bright, attentive, and remarkably self-contained for her age. She said self-contained in the tone of someone who meant it as an observation rather than a compliment, and Min-jun understood her perfectly. He asked what Seo-yeon enjoyed. Kim Ji-young said drawing, specifically animals, and that she had a gift for it, a genuine one, not the polite gift attributed to all young children, but the kind that made other children stop and look. She showed him a drawing Seo-yeon had done of a rabbit that was, he had to acknowledge, remarkably accurate in its proportions. He looked at it for a long moment. He hadn't known. He drove back to the office and told Jin Woo to find the best art supplies available for a 6-year-old and have them delivered to the apartment by evening. Jin Woo said understood and then paused and said, "Any preference on medium?" And Min-jun realized he didn't know what that meant in this context and said, "All of them," which was probably excessive, but felt correct. The supplies arrived in 4 large boxes. Seo-yeon came home from school, found them in the living room, and stood looking at them with an expression that moved through surprise and then careful assessment, and then something that broke briefly into undisguised delight before she composed herself. She looked at him. "These are mine." "Yes." She opened the first box with the focused attention she brought to most things, examined the contents methodically, and then looked up and said, "There are professional-grade oil pastels in here, APPA. These are for adults. You can grow into them." She considered this with the seriousness it apparently deserved and then carried the boxes to her room one by one, declining his offer to help, which he understood was part of the process. The school recital was in the second week of December. He found out about it from a newsletter that Jin, who had apparently been filtering out of his email for months along with the other school communications. A fact Jin, who disclosed with the expression of a man acknowledging a well-intentioned error in judgment. Min-jun read the newsletter, noted the date, and blocked 3 hours in his calendar with the label Seo-yeon recital, which Jin Woo would have seen and which Min-jun did not adjust. He arrived at the school auditorium in a suit that cost more than the sound system, and sat in the front row. The auditorium filled with parents arranging themselves in the middle sections, where they could be visible to their children and to each other. Several people recognized him and recalibrated their seating choices. He did not notice or did not care, which amounted to the same thing. The children filed onto the stage in their uniforms. Seo-yeon came out third from the left and scanned the audience with the automatic efficiency of a child looking for a known face, and she found him in the front row, and stopped scanning. She looked at him for 2 full seconds with the serious, assessing eyes she used for decisions that mattered. He nodded once. Something shifted in her posture, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who wasn't watching closely, but he was watching closely and he saw it. Her shoulders moved back by a degree. She stood up slightly straighter. She faced the front with an expression that was different from the careful neutrality he had learned to read as her armor. This was something else. Something that looked, cautiously and tentatively, like confidence. She played her recorder with complete concentration, and made one mistake in the third measure that she did not react to, which he found, unexpectedly, the most impressive thing he had witnessed in quite some time. Afterward, in the corridor, she found him waiting and stood in front of him and said, "I made a mistake in the third part." "I know," he said. "You didn't stop." She looked at him. "You know about music." "No," he said. "But I know about not stopping." Seo-yeon considered this. Then she reached for his hand, briefly, and let go before he could decide what to do with it, and walked toward the coat rack, and Min-jun stood in the corridor of an elementary school in his expensive suit and felt something unfamiliar move through him. It took him a moment to identify it as uncomplicated happiness. The drawing appeared on the refrigerator in the second week of January. Min-jun noticed it on a Tuesday morning, a large sheet of art paper fixed with 2 magnets to the center panel, depicting what appeared to be a tiger wearing a business suit. The tiger had a pocket square. Its expression was serious. It was carrying a small briefcase and standing beside a much smaller tiger, in a pink dress, who was carrying what Min-jun recognized, after a moment, as the stuffed rabbit from Seo-yeon's bed. He stood in front of it for a long time, with his coffee going cold in his hand. He did not move it. He did not mention it. He arrived home that evening and it was still there, and Seo-yeon was at the kitchen table working on a new drawing, and she glanced up when he came in and then glanced back down at her paper without the quarter-second hesitation she used to use, the almost imperceptible pause in which she assessed his mood before deciding how to be. The pause had been disappearing by degrees for several weeks now, and each time he noticed its absence he felt its former presence more acutely. The years of it, the way she had learned it so young and practiced it so thoroughly, he had never thought to ask himself what had made it necessary. He set his bag down and looked at what she was drawing. Another animal, this one a fox, rendered with the same precise attention to proportion that Kim Ji-young had described. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which was not something he had previously done, and Seo-yeon looked up briefly and then continued drawing, and the ease of that, the way his presence required no adjustment from her anymore, settled in his chest like something being set down after a long carry. "Who's the fox?" he asked. "Ha-eun," she said. This was a new name. He filed it and said, "From your class. She moved here from Daegu in November." Seo-yeon added a careful line to the fox's ear. "She doesn't know very many people yet. We eat lunch together now." He absorbed this. "What's she like?" Seo-yeon considered the question with the seriousness she brought to accurate answers. "She's funny. Not trying to be funny. Just actually funny, like she says things and then seems surprised that they were funny." She paused. "She also knows a lot about frogs, which is a strange thing to know a lot about, but it's actually very interesting once she explains it." Min-jun looked at his daughter's face while she said this, the unself-conscious animation in it, the absence of the monitoring he had watched her perform for months at every social interaction, the assessment of the room and adjustment of the self and careful management of visibility. She was not performing anything. She was just talking about her friend. He excused himself before she could see his expression, and went to his study, and stood at the window for several minutes. Ha-eun came to the apartment for the first time on a Saturday in late January, delivered by a grandmother, who shook Min-jun's hand at the door with the cautious fortitude of a woman who had decided to be brave about this and was succeeding through sheer will. Ha-eun herself was small and bright-eyed and assessed Min-jun with frank curiosity for approximately 4 seconds before apparently reaching a satisfactory conclusion and walking past him into the apartment, where Seo-yeon was waiting. Min-jun watched them disappear down the hallway toward Seo-yeon's room, already talking over each other about something involving a nature documentary, and a disagreement about whether deep-sea fish counted as interesting or frightening, and then looked at Ha-eun's grandmother, who looked back at him, and they shared the brief wordless acknowledgement of two people who had both just witnessed something that required no commentary. From Seo-yeon's room, he heard laughter. Not the polite, measured laughter she had used at Chai-won's party, the laughter of a child performing enjoyment for an audience. This was different. Louder than he expected. Unguarded, with that slightly disproportionate quality that genuine amusement produced when it had been compressed for a long time. He went to make tea for Ha-eun's grandmother, and stood in the kitchen listening to it travel down the hallway. Kim Ji-young called in February to tell him that Seo-yeon had begun participating in class discussions. Not just answering when called on but volunteering answers. She had also, apparently, corrected a factual error in a lesson about migratory birds with the careful courtesy of someone who wanted to be accurate without being unkind about it, which had impressed Kim Ji-young considerably, and caused the child beside her to lean over and ask how she knew that. Min-jun thanked her and ended the call and sat with that information. He thought about the version of Seo-yeon, who had eaten alone at the end of a cafeteria table with her tray angled slightly away. He thought about the 3 incident reports stamped "will monitor." He thought about the practiced performance of not minding, worn so consistently it had started to look like personality. Something had been underneath that performance the entire time, curious, precise, funny in the way Ha-eun was funny, full of specific and surprising knowledge about the things she loved. It had been there all along, waiting for a space large enough to exist in. He had spent 6 years not making that space. He was making it now, imperfectly and late, but he was making it, and what it was producing was something he had no adequate word for except that it felt irreversible in the best possible way, like a door he had finally opened that he would never be able to close, and had no desire to. It was an ordinary Tuesday in March. The kind of morning that announced nothing, grey sky with the particular flatness that preceded spring in Seoul, the city not yet warm enough to open windows, but no longer cold enough to justify the heaviest coats. Seo-yeon's winter uniform had been replaced with the lighter one 2 weeks ago per the school's seasonal schedule, and it was slightly too big across the shoulders because Min-jun had ordered the next size up on the advice of Mrs. O, who had said she would grow into it by autumn. He was in the kitchen at 7:15 when she appeared. She was wearing the uniform with her hair in 2 uneven braids she had done herself, a project she had undertaken with complete independence since January despite the results being, by any objective measure, asymmetrical. The left braid was tighter than the right. The right one had a section near the bottom that had escaped and curled freely against her neck. She had assessed them in the mirror that morning, he knew, because he had heard the bathroom door open and close 3 times in the deliberative pattern she used when she was making a decision, and she had come out wearing them as they were. He had learned not to offer to fix them. She climbed onto the kitchen stool and pulled her bowl toward her and began eating with the focused efficiency of someone who had places to be, and Min-jun poured her orange juice and set it beside the bowl without being asked, and she said thank you without looking up from her cereal, and this, the easiness of it, the unremarkable domestic fluency, was something he still noticed every time, though he had stopped being surprised by it. Ha-eun's bringing her frog book today, Seo-yeon said, between spoonfuls. The one about the Amazon. The one about all of them. It has a fold-out map. She considered this. I don't know why a book about frogs needs a fold-out map, but Ha-eun says it's important for context. Ha-eun has strong opinions about context. Ha-eun has strong opinions about everything. She said this with the specific warmth of someone describing a quality they had decided to admire rather than find exhausting. She finished her cereal and carried the bowl to the sink and rinsed it, a habit she had developed independently sometime in February that Min-jun had noted without commenting on because some things were better received than acknowledged. She collected her backpack from its place by the entrance, the large one with the small embroidered rabbit patch on the front strap that she had iron-pressed on herself with Mrs. O's assistance and considerable personal ceremony. She checked the front pocket twice, pencil case, water bottle, the folded piece of paper that was either a completed worksheet or a drawing, he could not tell from the angle. She straightened up and looked at him. Ready, she said. They took the elevator down in comfortable silence. Sung-ho was waiting at the building entrance, the car idling at the curb, and he nodded at Seo-yeon, who nodded back with the gravity she reserved for people she had decided deserved her respect. She had started doing this sometime in the fall, extending the same serious acknowledgement to Sung-ho and Mrs. O and Kim Ji-young that she had previously reserved only for adults who frightened her. And Min-jun had understood it as what it was, the behavior of a child who had started to feel secure enough to extend trust outward rather than conserving it. The drive to school took 11 minutes. Seo-yeon spent the first 5 looking out the window, and the last 6 explaining to Min-jun the life cycle of a poison dart frog, which was apparently the subject of a chapter Ha-eun had read aloud to her over the phone the previous evening. Min-jun listened with attention that was not performed. He had developed a functional knowledge of amphibian biology over the preceding 6 weeks that he suspected was broader than most men in his professional circle. Sung-ho pulled up to the school gate at 7:41. Seo-yeon gathered her backpack and moved toward the door and then stopped. She turned back and looked at him with the assessing expression that had once meant she was calculating the safest way to be and now meant something else entirely, something more straightforward and more vulnerable than calculation. She reached for his hand. He took it. They walked together from the car to the school gate, the 11 seconds it took to cover that distance containing something that had no correct unit of measurement. At the gate she stopped and turned and looked up at him, and he looked back at her, and nothing was said because nothing needed to be. She walked through the gate without looking back. Min-jun stood at the gate for a moment longer than was necessary. He watched the door at the end of the path close behind her, the ordinary institutional door of an ordinary school building, unremarkable in every measurable way. He stood there with the morning moving around him, parents passing, the city beginning its day with its usual indifference, and he understood with complete clarity that this was it. Not the empire. Not the carefully constructed architecture of power and insulation and controlled consequence he had spent 20 years building. This 11 seconds and an asymmetrical braid and a child walking through a door without looking back, because she no longer needed to check that he was still there. He turned and walked back to the car. Sung-ho held the door. Min-jun got in. The car pulled into traffic. For the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, his mind was entirely quiet. No strategies assembling themselves. No calculations running beneath the surface. No awareness of leverage or exposure, or the shifting geometries of power that had formed the background frequency of his thinking for as long as he had been himself. Just the morning. Just the unremarkable Tuesday of it. Just his daughter's hand in his, 11 seconds long, and the understanding that he would dismantle everything he had ever built before he let go of it again.